strength in our Redeemer. Amen. I was born in 1961 in Memphis, Tennessee. I spent my early childhood years there, and then my father received a call to go to Nashville to a brand new neighborhood that had a brand new church, and he was their first full-time rector. My younger sister and I shared a bedroom in this little split-level house in this new neighborhood. We had a lava lamp as a nightlight. It was all very 1960s, 1970s. It was an idyllic and wonderful place to grow up. We lived kind of on the top of this hillside, or about halfway up a hillside, and behind us and every other house around was woods for several acres. It was picturesque, it was beautiful, it was a fun place to be a kid. When I was in the 5th grade, my father received a call to come be rector of the downtown church in Knoxville, and he accepted and told us we would be moving. I was devastated. I remember thinking that my entire life was over. My life was being torn apart. This perfect house, this perfect life, this perfect neighborhood, the perfect group of friends was being shattered, and I was having to move on from that into who knows what. We were still in Knoxville my 16th year, or my 16th birthday. And if I'm honest, all through my 16th birthday, I held that secret belief. It wasn't just a belief. I knew it to be true that at some point during the day, my parents were going to surprise me with a brand new car. I knew it. They didn't. It was the greatest disappointment of my 16th year. That same year, as summer approached, my parents asked me if I was going to attend summer camp that summer. And so I had to make a decision. Was I going to go? Was I not going to go? And ultimately, I decided not to go because I had this brand new thing called a driver's license. And I really wanted to experience what the freedom of being able to move around town on my own and experience what it was like that summer. That was the biggest decision of my 16th year, whether or not go to summer camp that summer. 215 years before I was born, another future Episcopal priest was born, this time in Sussex County, Delaware. He was born into slavery, and his name was Absalom Wynkoop. You see, being a slave, he didn't get to have his own last name. He took the last name of his owner. It was only later in life, when he finally received his freedom, that he decided to take a name of his own choosing, and at that point, he became Absalom Jones, which is the name I will call him by from here on out. Eventually, his owner, Wynkoop, transferred the ownership of Absalom Jones and Absalom Jones's entire family, his mother and his siblings. Wynkoop transferred that to his son, Benjamin Wynkoop, who in Absalom Jones's 16th year decided that he wanted to give up farming and move to Philadelphia to become a merchant. So he sold Absalom Jones's family, kept Absalom Jones himself, and moved off to Philadelphia with Absalom Jones. In his 16th year, Absalom Jones' family were sold. He was forced to move. He had no choice. He was a slave. I've told you these two stories, my story and his story, for a very intentional purpose. I was 16 years old, and my biggest disappointment I experienced of that entire year was that I did not get the birthday present I wanted. I was 16 years old, and the biggest decision I had weighing on my young shoulders was, should I go to summer camp? Absalom Jones was 16 years old, and the biggest crisis of his life was having his owner sell the rest of his family to someone else and then move away with him in tow. Now, I want to be clear at this point. My point of telling the stories is not to draw similarities. It's quite the opposite. You see, it's tempting to listen to the story of someone like Absalom Jones and to draw comparisons with my life. But other than the fact that we both turned out to be Episcopal priests, there's no apparent real overlap between our stories. And I shouldn't take my experiences and extrapolate them to being like his. Last year, I went to the Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta. I've been a couple of times, and if you haven't been, I strongly recommend it, but one of the things I strongly recommend is just before you go for the first time, admit you're going to need to go several times, because there's an enormous amount of information there, as well as just at some point you get information and emotional overload and saturation. So I've been back several times. On this particular visit, I sat at the lunch counter. The lunch counter there is designed to look like a lunch counter from 1962, and you can sit at the counter, place earphones on your head, close your eyes, and imagine that you are an African American who's taken this seat with a group of your friends to challenge the segregated businesses of the time. I have to admit that as I'm waiting in line to sit at the lunch counter, there's all these pictures of people sitting in lunch counters, various places in our nation. And I found myself thinking what it was like to be them. I found myself thinking over the years what it was like to be them, placing myself in their shoes, placing myself on their seat. What it would like to suffer the insults, the threats, the abuse of those who challenged them at the lunch counter. And as I've thought about myself in that kind of setting, pictured myself there, I see myself sitting there as somebody's pouring their oatmeal over my head or pouring their Coke on top of me, suffering the indignities at the counter. And if I am truthful, what I've imagined that to be like is, well, being like in school and suffering through bullying. Then I sat at that counter and experienced this interactive yet pale reflection of what sitting at one of those lunch counters must have been like for those protesters. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't anything like what I had kind of projected it to be, something from my life. This was not like school bullying. And let me tell you, I know school bullying. I had my arm broken by a school bully. I've experienced that. But this was not like that. Because when I was bullied in school, I never feared for my life. I never in the moment thought that I might die. What those protesters experienced sitting at that lunch counter was different. These were genuine and menacing death threats whispered into the ears of those courageous people sitting in the seats at the lunch counter. I sat at the pretend counter experiencing those words whispered into my ears, and I was terrified, even knowing it was a simulation. I was terrified. It's natural for us to listen to the stories of the past, of struggle, of hardship, of slavery, of abuse, and to place them somehow in the context of our own lives. This is like when our family moved and I didn't want to. This is like when kids were mean to me at school. But we have to be careful not to do that. If we're to grow as individuals, if we're to grow as a society, then we need to listen, really listen to the hardships that have been suffered. From Absalom Jones's story with the sale and separation of his family in 1762 to 1962, when the governor of Mississippi ordered state troopers to prevent African American and military veteran James Meredith from attending classes at the University of Mississippi, to the hatred experienced by those freedom riders and lunch counter protesters, to today, when indignities and violence and racism continue to be an all too common part of our society. It's too easy for us to hear of these struggles and say to ourselves, sure, but I've had hardship too. And we have. But our hardship is not the same. Just as a battered woman does not need to hear from you as you share your story in comparing your pain to her pain, or just as a victim of child abuse does not need for you to tell how difficult your day has been in comparison to the struggles they've had in their lives. So do those who have suffered the pain and struggles of racism need to have their stories heard. Not compared, not referenced to something else that's going on in our lives, heard and understood. We must listen to each other's stories. It's why we reserve today for the commemoration of this remarkable man and Episcopal priest, Absalom Jones. I know some of us struggle with this. Why should we listen? What's the point? We've heard a lot of this before. Remember the slave owner who sold Absalom Jones's family and forced him to move to Philadelphia away from them, Benjamin Wincoop? He was a church-going man. He was an Episcopalian. He was on the vestry of his church in Philadelphia. Absalom Jones, even after all that he suffered at the hands of an Episcopalian, became the first black Episcopal priest in the history of our church. He did not give up on us. Surely we should honor him by not giving up on what he started so long ago. Amen.